Welcome everybody to this 6th seminar series of the second phase of the International PhD in Progress weekly seminar series organized by the Global South Network here at the University of Leicester. And thank you very much to the organizer of this weekly seminar series, Dr. Noman Riyad, who is a lecturer here at the Leicester Law School, and he's also the convener and founder of the Global South Network, which is doing lots of excellent, brilliant work. My name is Masood Ahmed. I'm an associate professor at the Leicester Law School, and my research focus is on dispute resolution within the civil context, civil justice systems and reform, alternative dispute resolution and commercial arbitration, and I'll be chairing this session. I'm also joined by Dr. Bishnu Pariyar, who is a lecturer in law, School of Criminology at the University of Leicester, who is the discussant for today's session. So welcome to you. His research interests lie within the area of the application of criminological theories and methods in the management of risk and security within the context of crime control and prevention. He is also interested in caste, ethnicity, migration, and access to criminal justice systems and transitional justice. Our peer commentator for today's session is, and I hope I can pronounce this properly, Ikechukwu Ugwu, who is a PhD student at the University of Silesia in Katowice in Poland, where he researches the accountability of multinational corporations and the rights of indigenous people. In January 2022, he received a prestigious grant from the Polish National Science Center, and previously his master's studies were fully funded under the Commonwealth Shared Scholarship. He was called to the Nigerian Bar in 2015 and is a member of the Nigerian Bar Association and the International Bar Association. And welcome to you. And today our speaker is Bernardo Carvalho De-Mello, who is a consultant lawyer at the State Department of Human Rights of Rio de Janeiro. He is currently pursuing a PhD in law, specializing in international human rights law at Newcastle University, and previously he achieved a master's degree in constitutional law and state theory and a bachelor's degree in law both in Brazil and a BA in history. Now, just in terms of the structure and timings, so Bernardo, you'll have 25 minutes for presenting your paper. This will be followed by 5 minutes for comments and questions from the discussant, and then the peer commentator will have 15 minutes of questions for you, and then after that we'll have some time for questions and answers from the and comments from the attendees. Now I'll pass the floor over to Bernardo. Bernardo, you're good to go.
Thank you. Thank Dr. Naumann for this opportunity and for everyone involved. So I better begin. I have 25 minutes. So the idea, and for those who I sent some documents, but the idea that I'm proposing in my PhD thesis is to create a taxonomy of discrimination. And I'll go into what is a taxonomy, but the idea came from, I was really taken aback with the question of George Floyd, and how could I connect that fact with, let's say, workplace discrimination. That's the slide, because both of them deal with discrimination, but uh, at face value, they seem to be very distant in terms of how we can deal with, which aspects are related to them. So my starting point was that how can I connect both of those experiences that seem very distant, but that have that quality of discrimination being central to the case. So that is the motivation behind it. And so the central premise of my work and my taxonomy is that every discriminatory act is an act of violence, but not every instance of violence is a form of discrimination. And this I'm basing, and this was the way that it could bridge the gap between George Floyd and workplace discrimination, but we can think of other uh, specific examples. But and this premise is not based only on my idea, it's based on Johann Galtung, a concept of violence, which I try to do a triangle. Hopefully it is good. But he has three ideas or three concepts of violence. So direct violence, cultural violence, and structural violence. And I found it very useful to link both of those events, as I mentioned. So just as a summary, direct violence is the visible violence, and it is the instances that we see cases of physical harm or bullying or microaggressions. So and this is why in the picture in the triangle it says it's the visible or success. So it's the part of the violence that appears easily in society. You have cultural violence, which uh, it is the way that that the violence used to justify and legitimize direct and structural violence. So it's those shared ideas, ideologies uh, that perpetuate discrimination in society. It's very, very hard, and that is why in his concept you cannot alter. I can dispute a little bit of that, but it's very hard to change the cultural violence in a society. But it has to do with those ideas of uh, ideologies and uh, sexism and Islamophobia and these kinds of issues. Whereas in structural violence, we're talking about systemic structures that harm individuals and that don't allow them to progress in society. Uh, most of the times you don't see a direct harm, but I think it is very, very intuitive to most people that when you have structures in society, institutions that don't allow people to have or to fully enjoy their rights, that is also a form of violence. It's not harm in the sense of physical harm, but is a kind of harm, and we should address that. And why choose this concept? I find it useful not only to link both of these phenomena, but also because it provides a nuanced understanding of violence. And I think a lot of times anti-discrimination law focus only on direct violence and structural and cultural violence, which admittedly are harder to address. They are in the base of why we see direct violence in society. So my belief is that this concept not only brings a nuanced approach, but also helps us to think of better ways to change society or in a more effective and sustainable way. So my problem, what I'm analyzing judicial decisions from human rights courts, specifically the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights, that address the issue of discrimination. I do have to say that when I say address the issue of discrimination, sometimes I'm dealing with cases that don't address the issue of discrimination directly, or they don't express that they deal with discrimination, but that I can see the discrimination is an issue. Maybe it was not raised, or maybe the court didn't acknowledge that it happened, but I'm analyzing cases where I can see the discrimination was a part of the problem. And what I propose is a taxonomy. And what is a taxonomy? So a taxonomy is, and this is a concept from biological sciences. So when we think of Linus Paulus' concept, taxonomy of biology, we think of Homo sapiens sapiens. So it is classifying things in order for us to comprehend it better, but also to group things in similar categories. It it has a lot of benefits, and also has some limitations. But I do think it's interesting because it is, since we're talking about judicial decisions, judges and courts, when you create a taxonomy, you're creating a common vocabulary. And obviously, we know that courts, they deal with a lot of cases. So when you structure something that is relatively simple, but that is also comprehensive, you can give it a toolkit for those judges and those courts to achieve better decisions, or decisions that actually achieve a greater rate of success in the concrete cases. So I just put here some utilities of a taxonomy. So the case of enhancing analytical precision. So because we're dealing with legal language, and we're dealing with the question of discrimination and really complex issues, when and this was something that in my previous research, and now also seeing sometimes buzzwords such as intersectional discrimination are used just because they are buzzwords, but in the case, it is not a case of intersectional discrimination. So having a more accurate and a more transparent way of using words makes it easier, not only for the claimants to see if their case was judged in the correct way, but for us as a society and for the legal scholars to see, okay, this decision was just, this decision didn't address this issue. So you're creating a more analytical, precise decision. Also, the question of consistency and fairness, which is something that as in the legal profession we try to achieve. It's a goal. I don't think we ever can achieve that, but having that common vocabulary, or having a standard toolkit helps achieve something closer to that. Also, the question of structural discrimination, since I'm talking about cultural and structural violence, it is very hard to see cases of structural violence. And when you see discrimination that is in the basis of society, it's much easier to see a case where you see discrimination when you have a law that says X is not allowed in this place. Whereas when you're talking about structural issues, when you're talking about a society that doesn't really deal with, let's say, the people in Crimea, and there's a xenophobic aspect, is much harder to see that in a judicial decision. So creating that taxonomy helps to address this issue. And as I stated, I think it is a challenge to address something that is so complicated, but also when we address it, the decisions and the solutions tend to be powerful. Also, since and this is Friedman and Fredman, sorry, she stated something that I agree. Anti-discrimination law focuses much more on the harm, not so much on the prevention and the remedy. So when you have a toolkit like this, a taxonomy like this, you can actually see which ways you can benefit or not from the decision. And just in general, having a clear communication, having training judges in courts to give better decisions. And in cases of, and I put this, the question of international consistency. So since I'm dealing with the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights, you have two systems that are really different. They have a lot of similarities, but they are different. But one of the challenges of both of these courts that they deal with a lot of countries and a lot of different cultures. So in the case of the European Court of Human Rights, you have Poland, which it's trying to have a Catholic change in the constitution. You have Greece, you have the UK, so you have different cultures. So it is really hard to come with a solution that deals with all these aspects. And the same for in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So we have Mexico, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile. It's difficult to deal with cases and judges from different jurisdictions with different cultures. So having that toolkit, having that taxonomy helps also in that question. The, one of the challenges would be and taxonomies, they tend, and this is the criticisms on taxonomy, is that they tend to be very rigid. They don't let space for changes. However, my taxonomy, I'm proposing it to be flexible. So my categories are not uh, they are not limited. They are open to changes. So I try to curb that criticism on taxonomies on that. And just really quickly, I draw from multidisciplinary perspectives. So to inform my taxonomy, I bring concepts from philosophy, sociology, and psychology. Just really quickly, so the question of biases, prejudices, uh, uh, in the social dimension of power dynamics, social structures, in the psychological dimension, as I mentioned, biases, prejudices, stereotypes, the differences between this, and in the philosophical dimension, the question of justice, fairness, and why is it important? I think in academia, we talk a lot about interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity. Most of the times, it doesn't really have an effect. In my case, I think it helps a lot because my categories are based also on these disciplines, because you cannot divorce the legal phenomena from the psychological phenomena. If I'm talking about discrimination, so if someone is racist, there's obviously a sociological and a psychological component to that, and it is that virtual cycle there. So it informs better policy making, enhances public discourse, and it just really helps on that. So I'll just go really quickly because I want to delve more into my taxonomy. But I brought two concepts of discrimination. This is from the European Court of Human Rights, and this is from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. They are not so important right now because my focus is not necessarily on the concepts, but on my taxonomy. And it will be a little bit harder. I'll show you my taxonomy as it is right now. I know the window is going to be small, but the next slides, it shows more clearly. So this is the taxonomy. At the moment, I changed the colors actually this month because it is a work in progress, which is something that I try to address a lot. So when I'm trying cases against my taxonomy, I change it. I see what it doesn't encompass, what it can be improved. So I'm not it is not something that is set in stone, and I think this is one of the the main points of my taxonomy. It is a growing idea. So my taxonomy, the way it works is a deductive method. So if you see, and I know it's really small, but if you see the more wine color red to the bluish one, so you get from the very general to the very particular, and this is for analyzing the concepts. When I get cases, I do the opposite. I do the inductive process. So I get from the very concrete to try to match to those very or more abstract ideas. So I'll show you in a little bit more. I think this is more clearly. So my first category is violence. So as I and all boils down to violence, and I divided into direct violence, cultural violence, and structural violence. And I use Bourdieu terms here also because it is very similar in terms of cultural and symbolic violence, and inequality for me is a synonym of structural violence. In the second category, we have talking about direct violence. The second one, and these are some forms of direct violence that I added to my taxonomy. So hate crimes, hate speech, police acts, body shaming, bullying, microaggressions, just to give some examples. And when we go to this part, which is the cultural violence, I put phobias, biases, so stereotypes, scapegoating, and other psychological concepts. For the structural, I put what I call isms and phobias. And this is something that I was asked about. What is the difference between a phobia and an isms? There isn't. I use it because it is the most common vocabulary, so I can see that courts and people will identify it. Uh, in psychology, when you talk about someone being homophobic, there is a sense of a more individual idea. So someone has a psychological view of a gay or people. However, we cannot deny that homophobia it is also part of a social phenomena. The same thing goes for what I call isms. So racism, in the sociological term, it has a more collective idea. So it is idea shared by people. But again, you cannot deny that there is a individual aspect to that. But I use that because it is the common language. But it doesn't mean that in my taxonomy there is a significant difference between phobias or isms, as I call it. And I just put some examples. So transphobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, racism, sexism, and approaches. This is interesting. So events oriented and process oriented. This comes from Mackinnon. He's a scholar. He did a work on this. So the idea that discrimination cases, they either tend to focus on a specific case or they tend to focus on a process. Obviously, there's another caveat here. There is no racism or sexism that is just appeared in society. Everything is constructed. However, when we're dealing with cases, it is useful to see if the focus of the case is more in the case itself or more in the process that led to that case. And that is why I chose this category. This other one is the main types of discrimination, as we all know or we're familiar with: direct, indirect, institutional, positive as in affirmative action, reverse discrimination, which is a very controversial term. I don't really believe in reverse discrimination, but I put it on my taxonomy. I haven't at this moment I haven't faced a case with someone alleging reverse discrimination, but I think it's useful to have it. And this is probably the most interesting part. So When you're dealing with discrimination cases, you have two categories. So you have single access and multiple access. So single access is when you're the grounds of discrimination is only one. So you're being discriminated against only, and I use only between quotes, only because of a religion, whereas in multiple grounds you're being discriminated against because of religion and your color, or religion and your nationality. And this I get mostly from Shea Atre's work, which is great. And she does this division, which I would love to go into more detail, but I don't have the time. Finally, we go to the very concrete idea. So I put here workplace discrimination, access, marital status. You have a lot of examples, but uh, it is not supposed to be a closed classification. So if a case comes, and I've already done this with cases that I don't really see as being part of it, it really doesn't change, because I can connect to the more broad concepts. And just to finish, this is the the final one, which is the origin. So where does discrimination come? Does it come from the criminalization of certain behaviors, uh, law and practices, unfair decision? And just to show an example, this is the Hamelin versus Finland European Court of Human Rights decision 2014. I don't really have a lot of time to go about it, but just basically it was a transgender woman. She was forced to decide, because the Finnish government didn't allow her, if she wanted to change her documents to have it as a female person. She was married to a woman previously to her transition. She had to either divorce her partner and enter a civil partnership, or not change her documents. So, and the European Court of Human Rights decided that there was no discrimination in that case. And this is just basically how I
Sorry,
did.
Bernardo,
So,
sorry, Bernardo, just to interrupt, you still have a good 5 minutes, so you can,
okay.
yeah, you still got 5 minutes, so don't, yeah.
Okay. So for me, this is a case of discriminatory law and policy. So the first category. So again, I'm going in the inductive reasoning. I'm taking the concrete, I'm taking the case, and I'm putting in my taxonomy and moving towards the more abstract. So this is a clear discriminatory law and policy. We move on to the next category. So this, and this is the problem. The European Court of Human Rights saw this case as only a case that was dealing with marital status. They just thought, okay, this transgender woman, she wants to change her documents, but she is married. There's no problem. She just has to enter a civil partnership, and completely ignore the question of uh, the prejudice and the questions of being a transgender person. So they ignore that factor. So there is that is a problem that I identify here in my taxonomy, where they don't address it. So when they make that mistake, and that is what I find interesting about my taxonomy, as we do it in maths, when you have an equation, if you make a mistake in the second or the third line, everything below is going to be incorrect because you made a mistake. So that is why teachers told us to actually write our problems. And this is the question of my taxonomy. If you make a mistake in either of those phases, you're going to have problems forward. So when they only saw the case as a problem of marital status, they saw it only as a single axis problem. And that led to the error in the decision as I see. So the rest I just say that is indirect and institutional. And going back to the question of transphobia and a form of structural violence. And the way that I designed my taxonomy to answer those questions is exactly to take into account that there was discrimination against being transgender. And when you realize in my taxonomy, in this graph, that there is this issue also, you come to a different conclusion. So you see that it's not just a case of a single axis discrimination. So it's a multiple axis discrimination. So that changes the decision. And when you see that, and this is what I'm hoping for with my taxonomy, if you change the way that you draw your decision or you draw your reasoning throughout my taxonomy, you come to a different conclusion, and hopefully a conclusion that is correct or is more just to the concrete case. So that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernardo, and thank you also for excellent timekeeping as well. You made my job easier. So thank you so much for that. Now we're going to move on to Bishnu as the discussant. So Bishnu, you have 5 minutes, and I'll let you know when your time's up. So I'll pass it over to you. I think you're on mute, Bishnu. Still can't hear you. You're on mute. Still can't hear you.
Mic check.
Now yeah, that's fine.
Okay,
Good, you're good to go.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. This paper is amazing, just to start with. It is amazing partly because it makes an effort to establish a new narrative. It tries to bring about the new discourses in terms of how we debate and discuss about discriminations in intellectual terms. And to be honest, I found it difficult to understand the taxonomy, the actual classification of it, partly because your research has, in a way, replicated the way in which species are categorized in biological science, and but my understanding is that you try to replicate that within the context of your research in a law discipline, I suppose. But what I find fascinating about it is that when individuals and groups are situated structurally, then even the law guarantees equality. Even the law guarantees non-discriminatory practices because of people's multiplicity of identities and their positions within the broader socio-economic hierarchy. And that's when that's the challenge that brings the complexity. And then also also, individually, we have our own multiple identities. It's fair to say we have our own multiple identities. And I have been working on a paper about caste and ethnicity, and even constitutionally, even if the law guarantees equality, because people have that multiple identities depending on the caste itself, the gender, the locations in which, the regional locations in which these people experiences those form of discriminations. So because of the intersectionality in people's identity, this issue becomes incredibly difficult to track down. But then now you have introduced this taxonomy. I think that makes life a little bit structured. That it will have a unique contribution to make in the debate in discrimination. And that's fascinating. But my question here is, because we have our own multiple identities, and we are trying to come up with this taxonomy, which presumably it's going to be used at some point, be exercised, and it is going to have impact on decisions made. It will have impact on, who is going to be the victim, who is going to be the perpetrators, and those kinds of things. How have you considered your own identity in terms of coming up with this taxonomy, in terms of your own positionality?
Thank you for the comments, and I appreciate the comments. I'll just address the question of I justify my taxonomy as being based in biology, but I do find it that there's a significant difference there, because my taxonomy is open. So and unfortunately, obviously I didn't have the time, but it's for example, I was dealing with a case, and that is why I mentioned the case of Crimean nationals, which was a case in the European Court of Human Rights that was dealing with the deportation to Crimean nationals from Ukraine to Russia. This was 2014. And there they were tortured and some were killed. And it went to the European Court of Human Rights, and they completely ignored the question of xenophobia and national origin discrimination. Obviously, in that case, I do think the salient part was the human rights violations of people being tortured. But if they had looked at my taxonomy and see that there is also space there to see that there is an aspect of discrimination, it would help for at least for it to be addressed. So I do think my taxonomy is flexible enough to be interpreted in categories that are not necessarily there. And which again, my list is not closed. You can put different cases inside those boxes, and if I justify that they belong there, they don't necessarily have to be named in that way. But just answer your main question. It's one of the first things that I deal with. It's the positionality. I think coming from Latin America, being a Latin American a scholar, and seeing the way that structural violence comes about, I think it shapes the way that I see discrimination. It's not to say that direct discrimination or direct violence is not important, but I do think that my view tends to be more of the big picture and how to change that. Obviously, the flip side of that is when you think of the big picture, it requires more complex solutions, and that is why I'm trying. Obviously, this is a small part, but if I can get courts or judges to have better decisions, both in an analytical sense and in a social awareness sense, then I can see a bit of those structural big picture changes that I try to get. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And the reason why I wanted to flag this up right in the beginning is that I got into a little bit of hot water myself when I was defending my PhD thesis, and I was working with one particular community that I shared my own background. Maybe I should not have mentioned it as the Viva progressed. I mentioned it, and then the subtle intellectual attack began to come. So I was expected to write, literally another chapter. And potentially, this might be an area where you might be questioned on the methodological approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bishnu. Thank you so much for all those comments and the question at the end, and Bernardo for answering that. So we'll just move on to our peer commentator, Ikechukwu. I'll pass it over to you. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Bernardo, for that wonderful presentation. When I was going through your slides, I think I found them somehow mechanical, but I enjoyed reading it. So your presentation offers a comprehensive framework, for understanding the complexities of discrimination. I agree with you that every discriminatory act is an act of violence, but not every instance of violence is a form of discrimination. And then I've tried to extend this to things like racism. Not every bad behavior to a race amounts to racism. Yeah. So you equally recognized the place of culture or cultural perspective to handling discrimination. You gave the example of Poland and then the EU human rights system. And then last week, I read an article where the author, a professor here in Poland, he argued that for new taxonomy, for new recognition of rights, they are better handled at national level. Do you think that this novel taxonomy of discrimination should be better handled at the state level, taking into account cultural differences and then the potential of cultural clash at international level?
Thank you for your comments. I definitely think it in the national level it works best. It's more effective. I think in the paper, not the slides, but in the paper that I provided, I brought some criticisms of the European Court of Human Rights and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which obviously I didn't have time to address. But one of the questions is always if they are if the decisions are followed. So we do have a problem in terms of compliance, because you can make a judgment, but if I'm a country and I just decide to ignore, there are sanctions, but it is different from a national court where the question of sovereignty is not going to be asked as easily as it is in a international human rights courts. So we have debates right now in the UK about the UK leaving the European Court of Human Rights, which it's a horrible decision. But there is always this lingering question of this sovereignty and the legitimacy of courts of human rights, international court of human rights. So I definitely think national courts, they deal better. However, when we're talking about questions of national minorities and discrimination. So, for example, I mentioned the case of Crimea, but we can talk about Roma nationals. The problem with national courts, if we're talking about a country that has a structural discriminatory view against those nationals or against that particular group, you will get unfair decisions most of the time. So that is one of the benefits of having the European Court of Human Rights or the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. You would have, and again, quote unquote, impartial body. So you have a body that it is not connected directly to one country or to one culture. So I definitely agree with you, but I would just give that caveat of just minoritized communities. And in the case of my research, I focus on decisions from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights. But naturally, when I'm seeing the cases, because it is part of the case, I also see how it was handled in the countries. And if it reaches a level of human rights court, either the Inter-American or the European Court of Human Rights, it's because probably the national courts failed in some way, or we perceived as having failed in some way. But I agree with you in terms of being more, having a more concrete effect. But I'm a believer still in the power of international human rights.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, Ikechukwu, for that. and for your views and your comments on the paper. Now we have some time, about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So anybody who has any questions or comments for Bernardo, just use the raise hand button.